Tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to meet two very important figures in the community, but they're new to the community, to VBS. So I want to welcome all of you and welcome our guests tonight. We have a custom here at VBS that we do this as a community, so if I can ask you for indulgence for a moment, if you'll stand up and just turn around and say hello to the people standing behind you and wish them a good evening and a welcome. Good, thank you. Please take a seat, make yourselves comfortable. Tonight, as you know, the LA community is mourning the loss of Kobe Bryant, who was one of those very few sort of public figures who should gather this whole very diverse city together. So those of you who are not used to being in Los Angeles, it's not usually this depressive. And the community, the Jewish community, is celebrating the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And there have been numbers of commemorations around the community. So in response, we have a chance to do a little bit of learning about where we are in the world. We have two wonderful guests tonight. I'd like to welcome. Our first guest is Professor Dov Waxman, who is, let me define all this. Professor Waxman is a new professor at UCLA. UCLA is this small school up the street that used to have a very fine basketball program. The UCLA campus features, one of the great things on the campus is the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. The Nazarian family, a very generous family here in the community, has endowed a center that gathers up academic and intellectual reflections on Israel and its place in the world. They've been waiting a while to get a director, and Professor Waxman is new, and I'm going to let him tell us about his own academic background. But we're really delighted you're here. And we're really very grateful that the Nazarian Center is prepared to reach into the community and to join us in conversation and share with us. So we want to welcome you. Hope that we see you many, many, many times in the future. You'll notice that he has a wonderful accent because he was born in Texas, and he speaks with this wonderful Texan accent. So thank you for being here. And our guest, our honored guest tonight is Ms. Jodi Rudoren. Jodi had the wonderfully easy job of being the New York Times correspondent in Israel. You talk about impossible jobs, right? The newspaper of record for the whole world, and you have to find a way to write something that everyone is going to hate you the same. People on the left are going to hate it, and people are going to write on the hate it. And having retired from that easy job, she went on to the next easy job, was to become the editor-in-chief of The Forward. The Forward used to be the most important Yiddish newspaper in the world. And then it is recently translated into English, and now it's online. I hope you're readers. Some of you are readers. It's actually worth reading, and it's worth subscribing to. It's not very expensive, and it's a way of saying that I support journalism in the Jewish community. I'm a subscriber, and I'm a reader. And the writers for this, they're very excellent writing and very excellent analysis of the Jewish world. And there's very few journals left in the Jewish world that really have a national or an international perspective. An international perspective that gathers multiple points of view. And The Forward is one of those, and we're really delighted to have you here. And thank you for the writing that you do and for the reading that we do. I'm going to let Professor Waxman take over as our interviewer tonight, and hope that all of you have wonderful questions to ask to our guests. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time visiting this amazing temple, and the facilities are fantastic. I want to thank you all for coming, and I also want to really thank Jodi for sharing the stage with me. It's an honor for me to be sitting up here with you and engaging in this conversation. We have a lot to talk about. So what we're going to do is just begin to have a conversation, and then after a while, we'll open it up. I'm sure many of you will have questions for Jodi. Also, I'm happy to answer questions as well, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for some questions. But I want to begin. I mean, we're going to talk about Jodi's experience working for the New York Times, and particularly as Jerusalem bureau chief of the Times from 2012 to 2015, and also the difference as editor-in-chief now at The Forward. But I think given since I am talking to a journalist, it would be remiss of me not to begin by asking about the big news story of the day, And I'm not referring to Kobe Bryant, I'm referring to the Trump peace plan, which is due to come out at midday or 9 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow. And the meeting that took place today with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party, both of whom met with President Trump in the White House today. So let's begin with that, and how you're covering this story. And in particular, I mean, one of the things that, even before this peace plan has been released, critics or experts like myself have really been quite dismissive of the likelihood of this actually resulting in peace. How does that shape your reporting on this? Many people believe really that essentially this isn't really a peace plan at all. This is maybe more of an intervention in Israeli politics, or this is about American domestic politics. Are you treating this as a major diplomatic event, or are you treating this as just yet another partisan political event?
Yes. Well, I want to start by first just saying thank you. I don't know, is this on? Are we on? Yeah, oh, good. Very nice. Thank you all for coming and for hosting us. It's a lovely, really stunning place, and it's great to be here. I actually started my career in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles Times, and I lived over the hill for a few years, first way over the hill in Long Beach, and then in the Fairfax district, and I spent about 6 years at the Los Angeles Times. I haven't been back in a long time, but it's really neat to be here. And we're here because we really are, one of our major priorities for this year is to expand our coverage nationally and build up audiences and engage readers across the country. And I want to just mention, two of my colleagues are here, Rachel Fishman-Feddersen, our CEO and publisher, Lisa Lepson, our Vice President of Development, who also went to business school here in Los Angeles. And we have somewhere a clipboard on which, if you put your email address, we will sign you up for our newsletters and give you a 3 months of free subscription. So please, we're going to just pass that around while we talk. I meant what I said, just to jump right in, and as Dov said, we really are eager to kind of engage your questions and have a conversation with you. I think it's true that the answer is yes. There are clearly political maneuvers going on here by Trump, by Netanyahu, in terms of trying to distract from other domestic political situations that they each have, and also trying to make a particular case about who their friends are and where they stand, for Trump on Israel, for Netanyahu on Trump. But I think that while calling it a peace plan, I mean, like so many other things, President Trump is a paradigm shifter in our politics. And so the things that he does are so different from anything else that we have seen before, it is often a little bit difficult to grapple with how to cover them in a kind of mainstream journalistic context. What do I mean by that? So our foreign policy towards Israel has been fairly consistent, regardless of party in the White House and regardless of majorities in Congress. And really the positions across Congress have been a very narrow spectrum for 40 years. And Trump has just totally changed those paradigms. So this basic diplomatic principle that the issues had to be taken on together, that the United States could broker a plan, but that the negotiations really had to be between the two sides. He's just thrown that out the window. So on the one hand, I think it's reasonable to say this is not a peace plan under the way we would normally understand that. There are two parties in a dispute, and some third party will offer those parties an opportunity to negotiate an agreement to their conflict. This is clearly not that. However, it may well be a significant diplomatic move that will have repercussions about the conflict and really the future of the Jewish state, the survival of the Jewish state as a Jewish state. Because one of the possibilities in this move, along with some of the other moves that President Trump has made, is the death of the two-state solution, which, to be fair, most Palestinians, many Palestinians, and a lot of their supporters have been talking about the reality of a one-state on the ground for long before President Trump was in office, certainly while I was there. And people have been talking about whether the two-state solution is dead for a very long time, chiefly because of the challenge of building a contiguous state in the West Bank because of where the Israeli settlements that people don't think will be uprooted, and also because of the separation between the West Bank and Gaza, both physically and really spiritually in terms of the Palestinian leadership there. So lots of people have thought the two-state solution was dead long before, but various things that President Trump have done, I do think has eroded that, but the realistic possibility of getting to a two-state, having two actual states. And then there, I think, are real questions of if the two-state solution is no longer on the horizon, what happens next? I want to also say, so President Trump's first big move on Israel was moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something that many politicians in both parties had campaigned on and then immediately, as soon as they stepped into the White House, decided not to do, and that everybody thought was like total paradigm shift. Oh my God, this is going to be a major thing. One thing that I said at the time when it was proposed is I said I was very interested to see what would happen because the situation, the conflict, the negotiations, et cetera, had been stalemated and stagnant for so long that I thought that because this was something new, something truly different. I mean, it seemed like it would be the type of thing that could set things back, but I also think that, those things are catalysts, and it was almost like throwing a grenade into the situation, and who knows what could result. Usually there are some real casualties, but sometimes out of that situation, actually, things move. Almost nothing has happened. Really, it has had almost no impact on anything. I think it certainly didn't help Israel's standing in the world in terms of the countries that support a Palestinian state. It didn't help relations with the Palestinians, but I don't think it's demonstrably changed the situation. So there are ways in which what we think will be in this plan announced tomorrow in terms of annexation and extending Israeli sovereignty and doing all of this without any engagement with the Palestinians themselves, that feels quite aggressive and surprising and totally paradigm shifting. And I would say that is true. It's possible that will act like a real catalyst to shake things up, sort of first setting back and then potentially having progress. And it's also possible that, it'll just be more kind of noise.
Right. I mean, the irony, of course, I agree. I think when the Trump administration came into office, this kind of willingness to challenge some of the sacred cows of the peace process, the willingness to ask questions about, well, is a two-state solution still necessarily the best outcome? Should we continue to maintain the international consensus that East Jerusalem should go to a Palestinian state? What about the Golan Heights or the status of settlements? Is it really realistic to expect many settlements to be evacuated? The willingness to ask these kinds of questions, I think, was important, and actually in many ways was necessary to challenge a lot of the kind of stale orthodoxy that existed around how to resolve the conflict, because everybody who paid any attention knew that that orthodoxy was increasingly out of touch with the reality on the ground. So in that respect, the great disruptor, as President Trump is useful. My concern, particularly with this peace plan, is that in shattering these, in smashing these, slaughtering, I should say, the metaphor, these sacred cows, and overturning or trying to overturn the consensus around how to resolve the conflict, the long-term outcome of this actually could be far worse for Israel. In particular, because it could raise the possibility of a one-state solution, which is in many ways the biggest threat to Israel's existence as a Jewish and democratic state. So the concern, if you do open up these questions and say, well, okay, maybe we need to think about a reality in which Israel retains control over settlements in the West Bank, because it's really, I think I would agree, and most experts would agree, it's unrealistic to expect any future Israeli government to order a mass evacuation of, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. It's just not going to happen. Whether you think it should or shouldn't is secondary. It's not on the cards, and therefore, recognizing reality is important. The challenge, though, becomes once you start moving away from that, the next step will be for Palestinians in those areas or adjacent to those areas say, fine, annex it, we want citizenship. And that is the great fear. So ultimately, this consensus that the Trump administration, along with some in Israel, have been very willing to challenge is a consensus that ultimately I think is one that has served Israel's interest rather than...
So I really agree with you that the true existential threat to Israel's survival as a Jewish democracy is the end of the two-state possibility. I 100% agree with you. I also think that it's very important to understand that the status quo is not sustainable, and that the sort of endless extension of the status quo is the same threat, is the path to that threat. So the question, I clearly the way that this moves us towards a one-state reality or the death of the two-state solution seems like it moves us towards that very serious threat to Israel's ability to remain both a Jewish state and a democracy. However, in that way of forcing something, it just, you never know. But I want to ask you, Dov, to share. I feel like, I think you've talked to me about this before, and many professors have laid this out for me. I think it's really important to talk a little bit about the way that in Israel, it has been generally the right that has made moves towards peace and concessions and not the left. I think that's surprising to people, and I wonder if you could give a little sure on that.
Well, in terms of, obviously the most famous kind of peacemaker that comes to many people's mind is Yitzhak Rabin, the assassinated Israeli premier. But of course, the beginning really of the peace process came under Menachem Begin, under the Likud, with the Camp David agreement and then the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. That was the first time that an Israeli leader agreed to withdraw from territory. So the idea of land for peace, the principle of land for peace, and in the case of the Camp David Accords, complete withdrawal from every inch of occupied territory, and there were settlements in the Sinai, as well as plentiful gas reserves, which were valuable for Israel at the time. So in many ways, the principle was actually established by Begin. He also was the first Israeli premier, not many people remember this, who recognized the existence of the Palestinian nation. It's the first Israeli premier who did that in the Camp David Accords. Netanyahu, also regarded in the public imagination as a ardent hawk who has always opposed concessions, he was the first Likud leader to actually authorize a withdrawal from part of the West Bank, Hebron, in the Hebron Accord.
And Ariel Sharon, of course.
And Ariel Sharon, of course, with the withdrawal from Gaza, and possibly had he lived, a further withdrawal. So the idea that right-wing leaders have always been obstructionists is false. The difference today, though, and I'm not sure whether a right-wing leader like Netanyahu today could do it, is because then Begin had the ability to bring Likud with him. Sharon had to break apart the Likud in order to carry out disengagement. Netanyahu now faces the reality that there are many other, really the real dynamic, and you know this as well in Israeli politics, the real action is on the right. It's really it's the fragment, the reason why we've had 3 elections, we're about to have 3 elections, and it simply is because the right has fragmented. The right has been cohesive for a long time, and it's fragmented, and it's fragmented because Victor Lieberman took his Yisrael Beitenu party out of the right over the issue of religion state, recognizing really, in my opinion, that this is a winning political issue for him to enlarge his base of support beyond the shrinking population of Jews from the former Soviet Union. So that's where all the action is. So ultimately, if you want to move Israeli politics and you want to create change in Israeli politics, that you can't just write off the right or the majority of Israeli Jews. Yeah. And I think that's difficult for American Jews who tend to be on the center left, tend to be liberals, tend to vote for the Democrats, and that's very different from for Israeli Jews, and that is partly what creates this, sense of a growing divide, because Israelis have over the years shifted further to the right, while American Jews have remained solidly, in liberal camp. Just going back to the question of how we report about the conflict, I'm sure many people here have, been happy or angered by the New York Times reporting,
sure, wherever unsubscribed and resubscribed.
Wherever you fall on the political map, you're generally going to find something that upsets you, right? How difficult is it, covering a conflict such as this one, to try to remain a kind of above the fray, to know that every dot you place, every comma, every sentence, does that weigh on you as a journalist? Just knowing that, the level of scrutiny and often vitriol that you'll receive.
So I definitely didn't try to stay above the fray. I think you really want to be in the fray, because that's what reporting is. And the way to understand what's going on is really to get in and mix it up. And to try to, be deep and fair and human and empathetic to kind of all the players, and to just do the work of reporting, and then do the work of kind of stepping back. It is definitely true. It is considered the most scrutinized job in journalism, and a lot of advocacy groups on both sides have, I think, in their somewhat despair over the stalemated nature of the conflict, have sort of taken to attacking journalism and journalists as a kind of part of the battlefield, the propaganda battlefield. I found that really depressing. At the New York Times, the role of the journalists, the readers that you're really serving are kind of not those engaged in that combat, but really the broader world that wouldn't have any information about the Middle East conflict without reading the New York Times. And so I tried very hard to balance kind of anticipating that kind of scrutiny and criticism and attack without paralyzing myself and writing too defensively for, to avoid conflict with advocacy groups, because you can get really paralyzed and focused on what is this source or this critic going to think, instead of what are the readers in Ohio need to understand about what happened today. And so the other big challenge about covering a conflict that has been so stagnant for so long, and honestly, it's moved a lot more since I left than while I was there, so stagnant for so long and so well covered for so long, is it was just really hard to find. I often talked about Israel or the conflict in the Middle East as this very fast spinning top with a very loud and, hamster wheel kind of news environment. It was like the spinning top, and I felt like the advocates who wanted to change the situation were trying to kind of grab hold of the top and move it a little bit, and I was trying very hard to understand whether the top was moving in any particular direction, but I also was trying to find ways in to sort of tell the stories in a new way. The story wasn't really fundamentally changing, but there's always kind of a new way, but I thought it was really important to just make sure that readers were staying with us, staying with the story, and continuing to care about it. And so to some extent, I defined the project as dimensionalizing the conflict. I felt that the players in the conflict, because there was, again, so much news written about it, and it was often so repetitive and cyclical, that the players in the conflict were often caricatured. There was a sense of this Palestinian stone thrower, and this Israeli settler, and the peace negotiator, and the Haredi who was avoiding the draft, and on and on, and that they were almost referred to in these like routine news stories. They played these roles, and nobody really understood what they were like, and that they were human. And so I wrote I spent a lot of time in a village called Beit Umar in the Gush Etzion area, kind of on the road out of Jerusalem, and it was at this particular bend in the road, and it was a particularly apt place to throw stones. And so there was a lot of kids who grew up throwing stones there. And I just wanted to understand, like, how does that happen? How do you, like, literally, I didn't actually get this, but I was like, how do you make the slingshot? Like, how does that work? How do you learn how to hurl a stone to derail a car on the highway? And then what makes you go do that? And I spent a ton of time there and wrote a very extensive profile of this one kid from a kind of stone-throwing family, and it was kind of, it was really intense and kind of nutty, and a lot of people got really upset. Some people thought I was glorifying stone throwing, because the kid said, kids have hobbies, mine is throwing stones. And
But actually, there is an element of kind of juvenile. They do it together after school. It becomes a way of one-upmanship, of taking risks. Following on from that, one of the challenges I find when I teach a course on the conflict here is, trying to get students to appreciate the intimacy of this conflict. First and foremost on the geographic level. Especially here we are in kind of huge vistas, and it's so much land in Israel. It's all so packed together. People are so close, and that intimacy explains a lot about the conflict. But there's also intimacy in other ways that you can observe Israelis and Palestinians interacting. And I often wonder, have I conveyed not just the dates and the events, but this kind of intimacy, the nuances? What was the greatest challenge for you, or what did you think you couldn't do to convey to readers around the world the reality that you saw on the ground? Was there something that you were in finding whether this profile of a young Palestinian stone, trying to convey something to get them to understand, which is very difficult to do?
Yeah, I think, so one of the great things about working there is that people are very engaged in the news, very open in terms of inviting you into their homes and their lives, and very opinionated and talkative. So it is a playground for journalists in that way.
As an academic.
And so I did think that if you could get beyond some of those, the way that the debate, the official debate, capital D, about the official conflict, and get to the more human stories, there were a lot of opportunities there. I'll talk to your question in a little bit. I think it's a little talking around it, but I think we'll get there. First, I want to say that in terms of the intimacy of the conflict, one of the most surprising things is how bluntly racist people are there. But at the same time, on both sides, in all aspects, and actually within the Jewish community, there's a lot of blunt tribalism and stereotyping around different kinds of Jews. So it's much blunter and more open than the racism is here, but it's also much more rooted in experience. And I think that in that way that it's intimate. So when Jews talk about hating Arabs, the people who are saying this have had relatives killed in suicide bombings. And when Arabs talk about hating, Palestinians talk about hating soldiers or Jews, their kids are like going through checkpoints every day and being harassed by Israeli soldiers. They have real lived experiences. Like, so there's one of the things that, I don't know, one of the people talk, I think Eric Holder once wrote powerfully about crossing the street when he saw a black man in a hoodie and then feeling bad about that. And people have talked about that thing. But like, nobody who crosses the street, or virtually nobody who crosses the street because of that, has been actually mugged by a black man in a hoodie, right? It's like, that's like a real, like, that's made up. This is rooted in actual experience. And what's interesting that I think is really different from even 15 or 20 years ago, and certainly 30 and 40 years ago, is since the separation barrier and various other changes, those really negative, tough, life-changing experiences with the other side are not really countered by any day-to-day connections with the other side. You'll hear, like sometimes you hear President Rivlin talk like romantically about his Arab neighbors that he grew up with in Jerusalem, and there are some and people talk about when they used to go to the beach in Gaza or when Gazans used to work in Ashdod, but like that doesn't really happen anymore. So no Jewish kid who also lost a cousin in a suicide bombing, has a Muslim math teacher or has been to a Muslim wedding. My Jewish friends would, when I would say, like, I would be going to Hebron or to Gaza or even to Ramallah, and they'd be like, aren't you afraid? It was like, they were really scared of that. They don't understand that that's like it's just over the hill, and they have like restaurants there, and it's really, really outside their consciousness because it's just been closed off, so it's a lot of fear. So I left at the very end of 2015, and this feels like a really long time ago, but in October of 2015, there was this upsurge of violence that we called the stabbing intifada. There was all these really awful incidents of knifings, first in Jerusalem and then around the country. And, there was it was very close because it was first happening East Jerusalem neighborhoods in West, and then the attacks in either the Old City or in West Jerusalem. And I really wanted to do a story about a one-on-one relationship between a Palestinian living in East Jerusalem and an Israeli Jew living in West Jerusalem who had some kind of relationship. So I started looking for those stories. And actually, I'll commend to you a podcast that my friend Dina Kraft hosts. It's produced by Hadassah. It's called The Branch. And it actually is a series on these kinds of one-on-one relationships. I don't know if you've listened to it, but it's pretty great. Anyway, I found one of the places where Jews and Arabs really interact closely is in the hospital system. It's sort of famous. And that was the last story I wanted to do, but that was one I ended up trying to report out. And I found these two doctors, surgeons, who had been working together really closely for a really long time, and also had just treated, there was one of these stabbings aboard a bus in Talpiot, which was there was Americans involved. It was a very resonant story for kind of our readers. And they had treated him, and they had also treated the killer in another thing. So they seemed really interesting. So I started spending some time with them. I wanted to do a really deep, full portrait of this relationship. And two things happened that made me decide not to do the story. Well, one thing happened that made me decide not to do the story. The other one I just found really interesting. So the thing that was just really interesting was I asked what language they spoke to each other, and whether the Jewish doctor was fluent in Arabic as well as Hebrew. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And of course, their entire relationship took place in Hebrew. Also, the Palestinian doctor had visited the Israeli doctor's home, but never the reverse. And the thing about the language that was interesting was often, this was at a Hadassah hospital, and often the majority of the medical team would be Palestinian, and yet they would, again, just reflexively. And I remember the Jewish doctor, when I asked him about this, he's like, I'm not that good at languages. And I was like, I said to the Palestinian guy, I'm like, are you really good at languages? He was like, no, I don't know. That's what I speak. I speak this language. So I thought that was really interesting about how where privilege and power play out. But the reason I didn't do the story is because the Palestinian doctor said that I couldn't write about what neighborhood he lived in. He lived in the same neighborhood that the killer on the bus lived in. And he just said, I won't be able to keep working. My patients won't treat me the same way, and I just can't risk that. And I thought that that was really, I felt like I couldn't do the story without saying where he lived. I thought it didn't seem honest, but I don't know, it was just really sad.
So one of the cliches that's often been said about the American Jewish conversation, or the American conversation about Israel and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict versus the internal conversation within Israel, is that Israelis have this kind of robust, vigorous debate about the conflict, and there's a whole range of opinions, whereas the debate here, if it is non-existent or used to be non-existent, and there's very little debate. Do you think that's changing now in your position as editor of The Forward, which really is a venue for this debate, which has been, taking place increasingly vociferously in the American Jewish community and now in American politics? Do you think it's still true this idea that that there's a robust debate, societal debate in Israel than in the United States?
Well, first of all, the debate, I mean, there's not that much debate about the conflict in Israel anymore. The debate has decreased in importance in Israeli political
While
life,
it's risen in the US.
starting in probably 2011, right? So in 2011, there was this huge economic protest in Israel. The 2013 elections were the first ones that were much less about the conflict than anything else. And I would say many elections since then have returned to that kind of right-left paradigm, but has been more just pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu, and there's not really that much difference on the conflict. So I think things are so stuck there, and also the conflict has become very invisible to the Israeli Jewish majority because of some of the things I described before, that I would say the volume of the conversation there has in some ways gone down. They are and it's interesting, one of the things that we've seen, I mean, this will be a great political science study case for generations to come, to have 3 elections with basically all the same players in this period of a year. So between April and September, the volume of the conversation around religion and state went up significantly, and as did Avigdor Lieberman's votes. And I don't know exactly I mean, the campaign will really heat up starting, in the next couple weeks, but it will be interesting to see if that trend continues, or how, again, you really basically have the same electorate making the same decision 3 times. So it's just interesting. It's like
definition of insanity to
like
do the same
yeah,
thing
but it's like a
over and
rerun. I mean, I feel like I actually Trump said something kind of funny about that today. Of like, I don't get it. Like it doesn't. But I imagine that lots of political consultants on the day after whatever happens would really like to, I just figured out what was going on in my campaign. Let's do it again, And they're actually getting to do that. It's a little hard for me to say, because I wasn't really covering the American Jewish community kind of before. But I definitely I feel like we have 2 dynamics in the American Jewish conversation about Israel. I think that on the one hand, it's a smaller part of the American Jewish conversation. Many younger Jews feel more alienated or are just less connected to Israel. There's a lot of other stuff going on in the Jewish world, whether it's about like sort of Tikkun Olam Judaism, or there's this huge conversation around anti-Semitism. But so I would say, like, in the relative space in the American Jewish kind of engagement and identity, Israel may be down from where it was a generation ago. However, I think that there is a sort of 2-layered big conversation that's happening across generations now. So there's obviously a big thing going on among college students and 20-somethings that is more critical of Israel, or less Zionist, or more anti-Zionist than we've sort of really ever seen. And I think that those folks' parents and people of that generation are really struggling to talk across that divide, and that is a new divide. That divide, and then worry about that divide, is, I think, taking up a lot of space in the American Jewish discussion, conversation, and in the organized Jewish community is very worried about that.
So as editor of The Forward, obviously you're reporting on this conversation, but you're also shaping the conversation in terms of what issues absolutely, and in terms of what issues to give attention to, and so I wonder, in trying to cover this the ongoing issue, and in many ways the very serious challenges or threats facing Israel in the future to its existence as a Jewish and democratic state, versus the resurgence of anti-Semitism in this country and around the world, as well as we've seen over the last 2 years, the mobilization, particularly of younger American Jews, but not only against the deportation policies. You've seen Never Again action. You've seen actually a real, I think, emergence of a very active Jewish politics in this country in a way that hasn't existed for a while. How do you make decisions about what to cover these so-called Jewish resistance against the Trump administration, whether it be, rabbis getting arrested at ICE deportation centers, versus the issue of anti-Semitism, which is a kind of Jewish issue, and the issue of Israel. In terms of, with so many issues now competing for your newspaper's attention, in what you decide to focus on and prioritize actually shapes the agenda of the Jewish community.
Yeah. I mean, I would say of the three things you just talked about, which is kind of, let's just say anti-Semitism, Israel, and the debate, particularly the debate in America about how to engage with Israel and how to talk about Israel. And for shorthand, the 2020 elections, but really all the
issues
and all the ways that try to see the 2020 election and the American politics and polarization through a Jewish lens. So among those three things we're not picking, those are the three things we're going to do big all the time. And then we're doing other things, like today we had this huge profile of the Orthodox Dr. Ruth that's like totally fascinating, and how there's this woman, 32-year-old doula and intimacy counselor who's on Instagram basically talking frankly about sex to Haredi women. It's just a great story, and we're also doing like deep cultural coverage, and we publish in Yiddish every day. And so we're trying to, we're doing a lot of things. And we are trying to be really smart about picking and choosing and finding the things that American Jews need to know most and are most interested in and will engage with most. But we really want to help shape and host that conversation. So I don't think we can pick among those three things. I think we have to really do a lot on all of them. And we also want to leave room to be kind of surprised and delighted and educated by what might be happening here in LA in the Jewish community, or one of the things we do every year is we have been publishing for the last 25 years the Forward 50. It's been a list of, it was originally conceived as a list of the most influential American Jews. And so I took over in September, and pretty quickly somebody was like, hey, are we gonna do that again? And it had been we don't have a print magazine anymore, and it was really a big print thing. It actually started out back in the days of the General Assembly being a big thing. It was given out there, and it was a big deal. And so we had a big meeting of should we do it or not, and people talked about what was good about it, what was less good about it. And we decided to do it and to try to do it in a really different way. So we made a few key decisions that I think changed how the Forward 50 read and relates to the larger project of how we're trying to transform the Forward. So the first decision was to take away the word most influential and just say basically influential and interesting, and to therefore really deprioritize anyone who'd been on the list before and anyone who might be sort of obvious, and to try to find interesting and influential Jews you might not know much about. You might have heard about, or maybe if you live in the community, but it was not going to be all household names and all people who everyone expected to be on there. Not Stephen Spielberg. Wait, there are two more things we changed. The second thing is we asked readers to help us form the list, and we got 200 nominations from readers, and we ended up picking about 13 of those people. Some of them were also on our original list. Worked out nicely. And the third thing, and this is the one that I think changed it the most, was instead of having us kind of write about them, particularly the people who were sort of very well known, and just kind of rehash their Wikipedia profiles, we put together a little questionnaire that asked them mostly not about their work, but about other things. And we asked them to just tell us in their own words. And that was things like, what do you have for breakfast? What was the last thing you listened to on your phone? Who's your Jewish hero? What's your most pressing Jewish memory? And people really responded to this. It felt much more real and much more surprising and a little delightful. Jerry Nadler eats gefilte fish for breakfast. I don't know if you saw that, but like, ew.
That changes my view of Jerry Nadler
Yeah,
somewhat, but I
exactly.
can't get that out of my mind now.
And like everybody was listening to Dolly Parton's America. Who knew?
So just to pivot somewhat to a more sort of darker note, you mentioned the anti-Semitism, and obviously that the resurgence of anti-Semitism, particularly the the deadly, violent anti-Semitism that we've witnessed in Pittsburgh and in Poway, and in other places, how difficult is it to, on the one hand, give adequate reporting to the violence that Jews have been facing in this country in recent years, without creating the misleading impression, or that I think is a misleading impression, about how precarious Jewish life is in this country. Because the reality is, this is still, in many ways, a place where there are huge, a flourishing Jewish life, and Jewish institutional life, religious life, cultural life, etc. And often, and I say this as somebody who, as you picked up, comes from the UK, where one of the things that always frustrated me when I would talk to my fellow American Jews about the UK is that they would only look at British Jews or European Jews in general through the prism of anti-Semitism, as if Jews in Britain were just cowering, and hiding from anti-Semitism, and that was what Jewish life was. And it was like, actually, no, there's a lot more to Jewish life in Britain, in Europe in general, than just anti-Semitism. And in many ways, actually, it's the best of times. In many ways, it's actually far better being a Jew in Britain today than it was, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, particularly when anti-Semitism was actually more routine. So similarly, isn't there a danger in our reporting on all of the anti-Semitic incidents and the debates to, I don't want to say exaggerate the extent, but to create a kind of Oigwalt syndrome among your readers that really the sky is darkening, we need to start thinking about leaving, when in reality, it's still, this is still a uniquely hospitable environment for
that's a great question. I'm going to reflect on it a little bit. We came in part for this Z3 conference at Stephen Wise Temple yesterday. Was that just yesterday? It was like many talks ago. Anyway, one of the panels, I moderated a panel on Jews in power. And one of the questions we talked about was, what does it mean for people to be both powerful and vulnerable at the same time? And because as you've just described, there's just Jews are in a great situation here in this country. We're overrepresented.
Most popular religious group of any religious group in the United States, according to surveys. Jews are more popular.
People, like other people say they like them?
Yes.
We have
more
good
than
approval rating?
The highest approval rating of any religious group in the US.
That's a great statistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry? Except among Jews, right.
It's really interesting. And we're overrepresented in every, in Congress, among Fortune 500 CEOs, among, half of NBA teams are owned by Jews, 6 of 8 Ivy League presidents are Jewish. So it's like, we're in good, we're doing well. But yet there's a real change in fear and anti-Semitism. And I think, and I guess what was interesting when we were talking about this on this panel is it's like our identity historically has been so wrapped up in vulnerability and oppression and minority syndrome. And we were having trouble dealing with what it meant to be powerful given that identity. And I think Netanyahu is a really interesting example of this because his politics is both about portraying Israel's strength and we can stand on our own and we will fight our own battles, and Israel's vulnerability, we are under existential threat all the time, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but so we were thinking about what does it mean for people whose identity is about vulnerability to be powerful, and now you're talking about also vulnerable. And a couple weeks ago at my synagogue, we had just kind of an open forum about anti-Semitism, and a woman stood up and said that she had gone to some kind of interfaith program at a church, and she had walked right in, and there's no security, and she was like, it made me really angry. And I thought that was really interesting because it obviously comes from also a place of such privilege. Yes, we have metal detectors at our synagogues, but we have money, we have metal detectors, people, there's government grant, and metal detectors, it's kind of okay. There's synagogues and we can go. And so I think everything's relative, And I think you're right. We definitely need to really cover anti-Semitism aggressively and well and understand what's going on, but definitely without a sky is falling kind of situation. Look, I was really struck last fall when the AJC poll came out and said that 25% of American Jews were avoiding places or events out of fear because they were Jewish, and 31% were avoiding displaying their Judaism. I mean, I was just shocked. I was like, it had never occurred to me not to go to a Jewish thing for fear. I mean, really. So we we really put out the call and asked readers about their experiences about that, and we published a very powerful piece about it. And we've actually then since done a bookend, because there's been this new move after the march in Brooklyn to have people like affirmatively wear or show. And so we did another reader piece where people shared their stories of why they've put on a kippah or in some cases gotten a tattoo. So, but look, I think that in some ways the answer to this question is the same answer as the other question, which is a yes and answer, which is that yes, we're going to cover anti-Semitism, and we're also going to cover the vibrancy of the Yiddish theater and the fact that people are doing Israeli dancing over there in that community center on a Monday night, and whatever's going on, and all of the creativity and vibrancy and kind of reality of Jewish life, and we write about like the Jews that win Oscars, and there's a lot to cover, and it's kind of, we can do both.
Well, on that note, I think we'll open up to questions from the audience. I think there's going to be a microphone going around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
My question's for Jodi. Is there any, with you as the editor-in-chief, any intent to put a little more balance on the opinion pages of the Forward?
Yes. I think is there not balance now, you don't think?
When I just looked at it, just pulled it up while you were talking. Well, I just pulled it up when you were talking. I didn't see anything that looked remotely right-wing or, something along those lines, just looking at it right then.
So I actually haven't looked at the site all day, so I don't know what's up there right now. I apologize. I've really been in blah blah mode all day today. But on Friday, right after the Trump peace plan was announced, we published 4 opinion pieces over the course of maybe 4 or 5 hours, and then we aggregated them into our newsletter on Saturday morning, and there were 4 very different takes on the Trump peace plan, and I'm happy to forward that to you if you give me your email address. The defining principle of the Forward's opinion section is to host the broadest possible debate and to be the host and the arbiter of civil discourse on the issues that divide us. So we want to publish respectful, thoughtful, provocative, well-argued, well-written, well-edited opinion from across the Jewish spectrum. And beyond it, too. We have we've just named 5 new contributing columnists. They include someone who I think is right-wing on Israel. They also include a Palestinian. And we're really serious about this. This is my belief. People have asked a little bit about, the Forward's editorial position, or are we progressive? And the Forward's ideology, and in my tenure, will be an ideology of inquiry and of debate and discourse. We're going to continue to publish those opinions across the spectrum in the opinion section, and we're actually going to take it a step further by we're creating a program called the Forward Forum, where we're going to actually bring people together in a room to have dialogue and then publish excerpts of those dialogues, because I feel like that idea of side-by-side or even 4 linked opinion columns kind of still is disaggregated on the internet, and people kind of can read easily only either what they hate or what they love. And I think this process of when people who disagree but respect each other, ask each other questions and push each other's buttons. I saw a great example of it yesterday, actually, at the Z3 conference. It's just really, that's where learning happens, I think, is when those dialogues happen. So we're going to be starting that really soon, and I hope that will help to give you a sense that it is broad and fair and across the spectrum.
Yeah, hi. I guess this could be for either of you, but we talk about anti-Semitism, but I was following the news for years now on anti-Semitism, and it seems like you can go back several years and you can see the rise in the more outward anti-Semitism, in the open, less hidden. Do we know where this is coming from, and how do we change the tide, because the tide is growing? So what do we do to kind of stem that tide and kind of turn it around?
Sure. So I think, there are multiple sources for this resurgence of anti-Semitism. We all know the statistics show that for the last few years, year after year, there's been a steady increase in the number of hate crimes against Jews. Just in LA, in Los Angeles, for example, just over the past year, there's been a real serious dramatic spike in hate crimes against Jews. So clearly, the statistics demonstrate unquestionably that there is a resurgence of anti-Semitic incidents happening. Might also, I think, as a note of caution, there's also more reporting of anti-Semitic incidents and more tracking. So sometimes the numbers might overstate the degree to which there's actually more incidents rather than more people reporting these incidents. And one of the things we've seen just over the last few months with the violent attacks against Jews in New Jersey and Brooklyn is the difficulty of ascribing this resurgence to a single source, right? It's obviously politically convenient for those on the left to blame the right and for those on the right to blame the left. And people want to kind of have a simple narrative that explains where we are and what's happening and why this resurgence is happening. But as we saw in the attacks in Brooklyn, and in New Jersey, it defies a simple explanation. I think in general, actually, whether we're talking about resurgence of anti-Semitism here, in France, in the UK, or elsewhere, there isn't a single explanation. Each place has a different context, and there are different explanations. I would say, overwhelmingly, the single greatest reason, not the sole reason, for why anti-Semitism has increased over the last few years is because of the rise of white nationalism or white supremacism. The fact is that the increase of attacks or anti-Semitic attacks have occurred in tandem with an increase of hate crimes in general. It's not just Jews who are being targeted. So there's a broader context, and that context is rising white nationalism and white supremacism. That's not the only, as obviously the attacks in Brooklyn against Jews were not motivated by that were not perpetrated by white nationalists. That wasn't the ideology behind them. But I think, going back to the AJC survey that Jodi mentioned before, it's important to be clear about the greatest threat facing Jews in this country today. And that threat is coming from, in my opinion, and I think the statistics bear this out, because those are the perpetrators, not only of the killings and the murders in Pittsburgh and Poway, but there's been something like nearly 50 attempted planned attacks that have been disrupted. So in terms of deadly, murderous anti-Semitic violence, that is predominantly coming from the rise of white nationalism.
And so I agree with everything Dov said. I just would add to it, it seems to me that there are, I think that racist and hateful speech has been empowered increasingly over the last few years by some combination of where our politics and political leadership is and social media. And also we see, I think that while anti-Semitic hate crimes are up kind of more than other hate crimes, I do think that the kind of open vitriol that now is kind of allowed in public discourse in ways that was not true before is part of what is happening, and it's happening to us as well as to other groups. And similarly, you have to also remember that Pittsburgh and Poway and Muncie and Jersey City are, and also Brooklyn, actually I would put the Brooklyn beatings in a little bit of a different category in this way, but those mass shootings and knifing in Muncie are part of a larger group of mass shootings that are motivated by other things, some white supremacy, some other things. But so in the same way there's been an empowering of hate and vitriolic speech and an acceptance of that in the public discourse in a way that wasn't true before. There also has been, by some mix of, I'm not sure what factors, but including gun laws and other things, just, the pace of mass shootings has gone up. And so we are part of that trend as well. So those are two kind of broader societal trends that are happening across that I think the Jewish version of is part of it. And look, I think that, there was some discussion around like the attacker in Muncie seems to have mental illness, and, it is both true that you sort of need to be psychotic or mentally ill to, go into a crowded party with a machete or shoot up and also true that picking as your target a particular group of people has to be motivated by something in your experience that leads you to that. I mean, we had an incident, I think I've read about incidents where like there's a kid who made a swastika on a desk, but the kid he was special needs, he didn't really know what he was doing, but it's like, well, where does it come from? Where do you get the idea for swastika? So I think it's both. It's both these big things in society that are about violence and hate and have nothing to do with Jews, and
Absolutely.
The increase of anti-Semitic tropes in kind of that they're just more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the conspiracy theories about Jews are not a monopoly of one side of the political spectrum, and ideas and these anti-Semitic tropes are deeply embedded in our culture, and the ideas and conspiracy theories, travel, or that like a virus once released. At the same time, I think, one of the things that frustrated me somewhat in the wake of the Muncie attack was this tendency to kind of depoliticize these threats and say, well, you see, this is a kind of generalized anti-Semitic violence. It can come from anywhere. It exists on the left. It exists on the right. We do, I think, need to recognize that there are far-right extremist organizations in this country who are actively planning to carry. I mean,
And
just
actually, even if-
recently, this guy who runs the base, this is a neo-Nazi network, was operating in Russia, planning mass attacks, and they're armed. And for a long time, Americans have been talking about the threat of jihadist violence. Jews have been worried about what's happening on college campuses. And actually, people really, I think, whether it was on law enforcement, right down to society, basically have turned or not given nearly as much attention to this continued growth and expansion of these far-right hate groups. There are many up
And I
in
think
California.
just like when we talked about ISIS and Islamic extremism, there was sort of the organized terror that ISIS leadership was actually planning, and then there were lone actors, including like at Pulse nightclub, I think, right? Who were seeing video, they were still inspired by that. And I think similarly, you can imagine that a person in Brooklyn, perhaps, or somebody else who is not a white nationalist might also, though, this is in the culture now, some of those tropes and those conspiracy theories. I also you just said something that reminded me of, on your question about how do we balance kind of coverage of anti-Semitism and not make sure it's in the context of how great it is to be an American Jew in a lot of ways and how free we are. One of the projects we really want to do is a sort of truth-telling project about the reality of life on American campuses. I think it is clearly true that there are many individual campuses or individual moments on campus where things are happening to Jewish students, attacks related to Zionism and rules about who can participate in what debate that are unprecedented and that we need to cover. But I think we really do need to contextualize them. So one of the ideas we have is to really do like a survey of how many BDS groups are operating where versus Hillel groups versus what kinds of speakers, and to also, we hope to be able to do a poll of American Jewish college students this year.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, as a professor, I often, hear from the parents or grandparents of students, and believing that their children or grandchildren are kind of under assault on college campuses. And I think that really misrepresents a much more complex reality, which is not to say that the experiences of some pro-Zionist students who are publicly identified is not sometimes one of harassment or intimidation or even silencing, and that needs to be called out and stopped. But it doesn't do justice to the fact that, first of all, the vast majority of Jewish students don't attend universities which have very active BDS movements or, are very, very politically active campuses. Most of them just want to, go to their classes, pay for their studies, find jobs. They're not dealing with that. Drink. And so I think there is it's been striking to me, given how important higher education has been in Jewish upward mobility in this country. I mean, it has been the motor for the amazing success of American Jews going back to the GI Bill and through the 50s and 60s. It's really been, thanks to attending colleges and universities in growing numbers that has lifted up this community and propelled it to such great heights. And now today, at this moment, American Jews in growing numbers see colleges and universities as a threatening environment for Jews. And that's a tragedy. It's not, that perception has taken hold. One of the reasons I think it's taken hold is because of organizations who do carry out these surveys, but often media and journalists report on these surveys which are misleading. They're a very small sample size. They don't really, what they define as an anti-Semitic incident, you have to go to the glossary and you can say, well, actually, would this be characterized really as an anti-Semitic incident? So this is partly what's created this I think, misleading impression of what's happening, is that the organizations, generally well-funded organizations on the right, who have been pushing this idea for quite some time now, that, their hostile environments to anti-Semitism is rampant on college campuses, hostile environments to Jews, and media organizations pick up a survey because it can have a very startling statistic, spike of this number of incidents, and that's partly what fuels this.
I have nieces and nephews who are in college, and I was in Washington over New Year's, and a friend of my niece's came to Shabbat dinner, and she has just finished a term as president of the Hillel at University of Michigan. And
She's one of the largest in the country.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, let's talk about what that's like, and how are you engaging with this group and that group, and what are you being, and she was very much like, yeah, I talked to the head of the Muslim Students Association, and
they did pass a BDS, a divestment resolution at Michigan.
She talked about that, and yeah, she gave me, it was really a good reality check for me. And one of the things we also are going to really try to do this year is to cultivate a cadre of voices from campuses, and just to really publish a lot of essays by American college students about all sorts of things. I do think people do need to hear from those people in not the hysterical moments, although also the hysterical moments. I mean, I think one of the New York Times published an op-ed by this kid, Blake, I forget his name.
That got a lot of attention about how the difficulty of being a liberal Zionist.
Gay liberal Zionist.
And now, just recently, there was one on high school.
Yes, right.
So,
good point.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, I think, it's
on that, do we have any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, if you have time for it, I'd like to hear some thoughts about Israeli journalism. How does it compare with American journalism? Where is it serving Israelis well, and all with an eye towards how well are Israelis being informed about their own society? And does journalism there provide a check on government the way we try to do in this country?
great. I mean, I bet you have a lot to say about this too. I can start, but I want to, with a caveat that I haven't worked in Israel since the end of 2015, and I haven't even been there since February of 2017. I'm going back in June, but so I'm a little out of date on this question. But it's really interesting. First of all, Israelis are definitely up to date. They are like so well informed, it's ridiculous. And it's really, and one of the great things about being a journalist there is the role that news and politics and the kind of news map plays in the culture. It is the social currency. Consuming news, talking about the news, having an opinion about every politician, it's amazing. I told the story earlier today, but I do like it, so I'll tell it again. But it's just, When one of my jobs here in the New York Times, or when I worked at the New York Times, was I was bureau chief in Chicago, and I covered 11 Midwestern states, and occasionally we would get sent out to do what we called a voices piece, which is go talk to random people about some news event and see kind of the pulse of the country. So one of the places I used to sometimes do that was in the Mall of America in Minnesota. Get some shopping in between interviews. And I remember really clearly one time going there, I forget what the abortion decision was, but I went to talk to people about a decision around abortion on the Supreme Court. And like you'd talk to 10 people and 5 of them like didn't know what the Supreme Court was. And there's some famous statistic about people thinking Joe Robner was on the Supreme Court. Yeah. And then of the 5 who you could talk to about this development, like 2 would have something resembling a quote. So in Israel, when you would go to do the same thing, I would sometimes go to do it at the Hadar Mall in Talpiot, which was basically where my gym was. But anyway, and in the time between when I would leave my car at the parking lot and when I would get into the first, dry fruit and nut kiosk and ask the guy selling the dry fruits and nuts what he thought about whatever Iran deal or whatever, he would already have seen on his WhatsApp a development since I left the car and heard on the radio. He would know more about it than I would. And then 10 out of 10 people would have an opinion and I could use it. So it's everywhere. And people are super engaged in the news. So the volume of Israeli journalism is very significant. And it's very staccato, and they take it very seriously, and they're very competitive. They are also radically under-resourced for a lot of the same reasons that half of American journalists have lost their jobs in the last decade. The industry has been radically disrupted, but also because of the ways that Sheldon Adelson's investment in this free paper, Israel Hayom, made it more difficult for all the other news organizations there, and in the ways that, according to the indictment anyway, that Netanyahu has really corrupted the industry by kind of controlling the media there. So what I found was that it was a very, I think I said this before, a hamster wheel environment, a staccato environment where there was a headline every minute on Israel Radio, on Galei Tzahal, on Haaretz, on Ynet, on Yediot, on Maariv, but each of them was kind of this deep. I was very hungry for more synthesis and more investigations, and there wasn't that much of that. The other big difference, which relates a little bit to your question, I think, the other big difference is that in Israel, as in Britain, and I'll hand it over to Dov to talk about this more, the partisanship or the ideology of each news organization was they were clearly partisan, coming from the left or the right or representing settlers or whatever. And also the individual journalists tended to write both opinion and news, which is sort of verboten in the mainstream press in the United States.
So just to briefly follow up on that, I would say, on the one hand, I think Israeli media is raucous, it's critical, it's inquisitive, it has, in many ways, many people have been talking in recent years about the threats facing Israeli democracy, the existence of the Israeli media, I think, is one of the great resources that can prevent Israel's slide into a liberal democracy. I think it's one of the bastions of Israeli democracy. And it's very, very important, and there is this long tradition of kind of critical, independent journalism. And the existence of that gives me comfort to know that Israeli democracy isn't as threatened as many people may believe it to be. That said, there are real challenges to independent, investigative, critical journalism in Israel today. Over this last year of the repeated election campaigns, journalists have been vilified, journalists have been, some leading prominent journalists have been depicted as enemies of the people, as traitors. This is incitement, essentially, which could lead to real acts of violence against journalists. It's making their job harder to do and raising the stakes for them. And I think we should be really aware of they're not being imprisoned like they are in Turkey or elsewhere, but the kind of threats, death threats, that journalists are receiving in Israel is new and very worrying. Where I think Israelis, and I think I agree with Jodi that, when it comes to Israeli politics and when it comes to what's happening within the Green Line in Israel, Israelis are very well informed minute to minute. Where they are in my opinion, very, very ill-informed, very, very ignorant, is what's happening over the Green Line. There's very, very little reporting of what's happening in the Palestinian Authority areas. There's very little reporting of what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And so Israelis, to the extent to which there really is a large complete disconnection between what's happening just a few miles away in the West Bank of Gaza and what Israelis know. They really do not know very much. So they went to the extent to which Palestinian life or Palestinian politics is covered in Israel, in the Israeli media, and it's covered very little, and mostly in like Haaretz, it's through the lens of violence. And so that's very problematic.
I would also, by the way, the state of the Palestinian journalism is terrible.
It's-
There's really no
And
independent
their journalists
in
are being
Palestine.
imprisoned and tortured.
And so that's part of that problem. And I would say the Haaretz coverage of the West Bank is also really, really highly politicized.
Of course, yeah.
The other thing I would mention is that there's a lot of Israeli journalism now available in English. So Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, and Ynet all publish a lot in English every day, and so you can read it for yourself. And the wife of an Israeli journalist gave me this great advice too. If you're interested in improving your Hebrew, your reading Hebrew, this is advice I never took, but I really believe in it. So Ynet is Yediot Ahronot's English thing, or there is English and Hebrew, and you can read an article. This is what she suggested. She suggested read an article in English and then you can click read this in Hebrew, and you'll already know what the article is about. And she said the Hebrew in this Ynet is very pashut, or simple, and that would be a great way to improve your Hebrew. So that is my free Ulpan lesson for you.
The final thing I would say that American Israeli Jews, Israelis in general, the Israeli media doesn't cover very well is Jewish life elsewhere. Israeli Jews really don't know much. I mean, again, when they heard it, it's through anti-Semitism. But their understanding of Jewish life outside of Israel, and in particular in the United States, I think is also not really covered very much. And there needs to be...
They should read the foreword.
They should read the foreword. There needs to be greater coverage and greater awareness, because part of the issue of the kind of divide between Israeli Jews and American Jews is the mutual ignorance that exists on both sides. And that's why publications like The Forward are so important there. Maybe you should have a Hebrew edition as well. Yeah. In trying to, overcome some of the kind of quite, stereotypes and quite crude stereotypes that exist on both sides. So I think we have time for just one final question.
Yes, I was wondering, looking at the papers here, the Jewish Journal, at one time was, I thought, a wonderful paper. Now it seems to be, it's going to become quite right-wing, but more importantly, what I'm sensing here is the use of anti-Semitism as a fundraiser. Who can scream, they're coming after us more, give us more money. And to me, it's an obnoxious use of a problem, and it expands. Our kids have been screaming, our kids are subject to abuse in colleges. Not the 90% of the kids, they don't know anything what the hell it's going about. But it's used as a method of hammering us for money or for other support. Dennis Prager, with his anti-college reporting, or what if you want to call it reporting, for years has been saying colleges are bad for Jews. Where would we be if we hadn't gone to college?
So
my question is do you feel that that the use of the fear of anti-Semitism as a fundraiser is our fault, and how do we go against that?
I don't know anything about what their campaigns have been, so I don't want to comment on that. I mean, I think, I'm not in the fundraising business. That's their job. But to me, what we're trying to do, and it's the same thing we're trying to do at the New York Times, is we're trying to create a product, a journalism experience, a reading experience that will be meaningful to you, and that you will feel adds value to your life, and that you will feel is helping to uphold our democracy, and that you will feel we need. And that I really believe that when you feel that, you will want to invest in that. because you will individually, as a reader, as a person who might have a few dollars to spare, but also if you are a person who is a Jewish philanthropist or a Jewish leader who might have more dollars to spare, that you will see that this is something that matters to you and your community and to our future. And so you will want to invest in it because it will be meaningful to you. And I do think that, I don't think that, campaigning on fear of anti-Semitism for money or for votes is an idea full of integrity, but I do feel like the rise of anti-Semitism is a critical issue in our community, and understanding it is important, and we should take it on with seriousness and with nuance and with context and with breadth and with spectrum, and that endeavor to have that conversation and that inquiry in a serious way should matter to you, should matter to the community, and will cost some money to do, because it will cost money to have people spend time doing deep reporting or doing a poll or investigating what actually has happened to the perpetrators in Brooklyn or any number of the other journalistic projects we're going to do. And I believe that we have a case to make about how journalism can make your lives better and your own understanding of the Jewish world better, and perhaps the sustaining of the Jewish world better. We have that case to make. We have to make it through the journalism itself. And I hope that the financial picture will then take care of itself. I really believe it will.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly, I think some Jewish organizations have been guilty of this kind of strategy. And I think in part that's, the reality is, unfortunately, psychologically, fear is a very, very powerful emotion, and fear, more than hope, is what motivates people to do many things, including donate to organizations. Jewish organizations that have been struggling to raise funds have found that, cultivating or talking about fear is more likely to get people to support their organization than talking about hope. What we can do if we want to stop organizations from doing that is show up not just when we're scared, right? So, Jodi mentioned the march across the Brooklyn Bridge recently, or there was the Shabbat after the Pittsburgh. This is part of the point. We want to support organizations, support Jewish journalism, come to synagogue, do these things, not out of fear, not in response to fear, but rather for positive reasons. And I think it's very difficult to get people to do that. And that's, I think, sadly, why many organizations have found that the most effective strategy to fundraise from a dwindling pool of supporters who are willing to give money is by playing to those fears. And I think that we've seen in American politics, in Israeli politics, and in the American Jewish community, that fear, unfortunately, is something that's very powerful, that mobilizes, that motivates. And if we don't want to see that, if we don't want politicians to exploit our fears or communal organizations to prey upon them for fundraising, then I think it behooves us to find other ways to decide to support these organizations, or to show up, or to get involved, or to display your Jewishness, not purely as a reaction to fear.
We published a piece, one of our new contributing columnists is Deborah Lipstadt, the amazing historian and of the Holocaust and other topics, and she wrote this piece about joy, not oi, and making your Judaism focus on like the more positive things. It's really, I commend it to you. You look it up.
I think we are out of time, so but we're happy to take questions afterwards as well. I just want to thank Jodi for being so engaging, sharing her insights with us. I know I've enjoyed having this conversation twice today.
And thank you, Ravi Farkas, and Valley Beth Shalom. We're really been thrilled to be here.
Thank you, everyone. And again, we hope this is the beginning of a good, fruitful relationship where we can partner with the Nazarian Center. Many more things to come. Wednesday night, we have College of Jewish Studies. Please join us for that if you want. And of course, this weekend, on Sunday, is our Shulper Bowl party, a chance to will be in the Levine Community Center, and the 2-story screen will be where we'll be projecting the Super Bowl party. So please come for that. And please stay if you want to ask questions, if they're willing to take questions, and have a wonderful evening.